Hi, everybody. That was such an amazing talk by Alana, and I'm so inspired by it. So I'm glad to follow this up. Hi, everybody. I'm Ted. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a senior product design manager at Wealthsimple. I just want to take a moment to, before I get started with my talk, to just give a shout out to Preet and the organizers behind the scenes at DesignX who are like keeping this amazing event going during like remote times and the community connected. I think it's so important to stay connected. I remember I started going to DesignX and conferences, and it was such an inspiring week. And I'm so honored to be sharing something that I'm really passionate about, which is like people, talking about how we organize ourselves in this new remote world. So before I get started, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. I'm fortunate to call Montreal my home where I work and live. But as I reflect on my own privilege, I must acknowledge that I reside on unceded Indigenous ancestral lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka peoples, past, present, and future, who are recognized as the custodians of the land waters since time immemorial. Remote Design Week and the conference's producer also acknowledges it is headquartered on traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat people, and is now home of many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And we further acknowledge that with the signing of the Toronto Purchase under Treaty 13 of 1805, it is now the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Additionally, I acknowledge the painful history of genocide, forced removal, and displacement enacted and enabled by inequitable systems of colonialism of our country on many diverse Indigenous people who continue to experience this inequity today. I encourage and invite you to reflect on your privilege and educate yourself on the complete and true history of this country so we can start to dismantle inequitable systems impacting Indigenous people still present today. You can take action by reading the 94 calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliations Commission report, which you can find at the nctr.ca. As I said, I'm Ted, pronouns he, him. I'm a proud Black Asian design leader. And during the pandemic, I've got a new hobby of uh, really getting addicted to zombie movies and apocalypse movies. So if anyone has a good recommendation, please tweet me later after this. A bit about my career. I've just joined the Wealthsimple team only 2 months ago as a senior product design manager. Before that, I was working at Intuit as a group design manager for TurboTax and Mint. And before that, I was working in the fashion industry as a fashion designer and creative director, and also as an art director for branding. I love design, but I must admit it wasn't my first true love. It was actually basketball. Before I was designing layouts, I was spending countless hours on the court, practicing my jump shot, and I was like really obsessed. I would eat, sleep, drink, live basketball every day. And because I was the shortest player on my teams all the time, I would try to uh, gain any competitive advantage that I could. I used to like study games, record them on VHS, and analyze the plays and do everything I could to learn about the best players and the best teams and how they all work together to win. Um, but there was one team that was a cut above the rest, and that was the '90s Chicago's Bulls. Maybe some of you know about them. Were stacked with Hall of Fame players, including some of the best players of the world, like Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and Dennis Rodman. And together they won 6 championships in 8 years, which epitomized the blend of individual achievement and cultural excellence. So as I started to lead teams, I couldn't help but reflect on my days on the court and what the relationship between attaining a high bar of personal growth and performance, and how these similar patterns are similar to like some professional athletes, and how it's all about mastering your craft, mental focus, passion, vision. And similarly, from a team construct, thinking about the team behaviors that translate to everyday work. And this led me to a question of like, what if we can, what if my teams were like the equivalent of those 90 Bulls championships teams? And like, how amazing would that be if like each person, each designer was able to perform at their best or be their best selves and be their best version of themselves as a team to solve like complex and huge problems. We'd be creating tremendous value back into the world and like making the world a better place. And so like that's pretty much my my why and like my passion behind this. But we've all experienced this new paradigm shift. We're truly living in historic times. Not since the age of like the industrial revolution has there's going to be such a huge disruption in how we work. And it's what brought us here today may not be what makes us successful in the future. And so it's really warrants us to revisit how we think about work. I think remote work has taught us new things like Zoom fatigue, which we never used to have before, or feeling disconnected, seeing increased rates of burnout, and feeling overwhelmed. Um, People are trying to balance their work life and their their life, and those two things traditionally lived in separate worlds, but now are kind of blended in together. Um, so today I get to like talk about uh, leading performance teams remotely in a way where I get to combine some of the learnings from basketball and design and people, all what I love, into what I've learned over the course of this time leading teams. And I've narrowed it down to four different pillars, which are essential to have in any good remote working team. And I think like things that you could be applied to any team and really just applied in different ways depending on how the team is constructed. First and foremost is really about fostering psychological safety. I think psychological safety allows us to have an environment where every voice is heard. It really is an environment that is conducive for personal risk. It allows people and gives people permission to fail, make mistakes, provide feedback, challenge the status quo. And sometimes those are harder to do when you're on a Zoom meeting. And we need to think of new ways of how to like unlock that personal safety. Um, there's been studies that have shown that teams that are able to feel psychologically safe tend to take more risks, fail faster, challenge each other, and evolve to better ideas. And we talk a lot about innovation, in the design community, but sometimes we don't look at what underpins all of that. And at the foundation, psychological safety has to be there. Once people feel safe, feel a sense of trust. Once they have that sense of trust, then they could feel more free to let down their walls and be vulnerable to share their own diverse experiences, ways of thinking, and views that add richness to to discussions. This then leads to an increased amount of courage and permission to take risks and even challenge the status quo. And that all leads to innovation. So if there is no foundation of psychological safety, it really inhibits like the ability to innovate. But psychological safety is not enough. We also need a high bar of excellence, where if not, teams tend to fall into a comfort zone and complacency, where it starts to seep in. You can see that also at the lower levels of safety and high bar, it starts to create stress. And I mean, without clear objectives, sometimes that is conducive for stress, which isn't conducive for growth. And then there's apathy, where people stop to care when things don't seem to change, and it makes it really hard to retain good people. I think Zoom and remote work has changed how we think about our interactions on a day-to-day basis. And I think we've all experienced this, like these kind of Zoom life moments where people are trying to say something but wait for the other person to come in or don't want to interject, or maybe you have some person that's dominating the conversation, or you have people that are just waiting for their turn and never get their chance, or sometimes people are process things in at different levels and only think of what to say after after the meeting. And so we need to think of more inclusive ways of allowing people to interact and communicate. And here's some things we can think about is like making sure that we're giving space. I think it's imperative on leaders and facilitators of meetings to set the stage of how we should conduct ourselves before jumping into the work. Um, and so give space, don't interrupt, invite everyone's contribution, and make sure that their voice is important as part of the process of going on to the next step and evolving to better ideas. So making sure and reassuring people, even remotely, is really important, because sometimes you don't feel like you're in the room, as if like we used to all be together and we all used to feel each other's energy, and now being remote, that's harder to do. Invite different modes of communication. Sometimes people process things differently, or at different rates. I usually need to take my time before responding and process the information. And Zoom, sometimes it ends up being who can jump in first. And so it's important to allow people to chat, or maybe add Figma comments later in design files, or invite people of other ways of communicating. It's also good to invite a challenge and debate. It's all, I think it's too easy sometimes to be on a Zoom call and is everyone doing okay, and everyone just kind of agrees, or if there's a tendency of having a group think, and sometimes we forget to ask the hard questions. So it's imperative on leaders to continue to do that, um, especially in design crits and things like that. Of course, it's not only what happens on in Zoom meetings. We are impacted by things outside in our everyday lives, and I think it's imperative on design leaders and leaders of all kind to ensure that we are aware that the world around us impacts our people, and it is difficult to approach sometimes, because we used to have those two worlds separate, but people are now experiencing these things and having to manage work at the same time. We have to remind ourselves that we are multifaceted, multidimensional, intersectional, and complex, unique human beings, emotionally impacted by the world events around us. And we have to be aware as design leaders on how it impacts our teams. So what can we do? Well, we can like use behaviors of vulnerability and lead with vulnerability, to have those difficult conversations. Sometimes just creating the space to do so and talk about things that are really important as human beings, rather than just the work to be done, is really important in ensuring that we're creating safe spaces for people. If you don't know how to engage in those conversations, then seek help, seek support of people that can. Maybe invite a person to come in, or someone from the DEI team. Speak from the heart. It's also important to say sometimes I don't know what's going on, or but you don't always have to have answers. Um, it's also important to maybe seek permission from people that may be impacted by certain world events. I think too often making the assumption that, hey, let's just like talk about this is the go-to thing, but sometimes those people that may be impacted by some of these world events might be tired, exhausted already about talking about, or just not willing to engage, and that's fine too. I think we just need to give people the space and the flexibility to adjust and come at their own volition. Of course, leading compassionately, sharing personal stories, and being candid and transparent is important. And most importantly, leaders have to regularly check in. I think too often we make the assumption that everything is fine, and it's imperative to understand what's happening behind the screen, what's happening when you're not in the meeting, and so just regularly checking in and making indexing on caring, because I've never heard uh, anyone from my team saying, "Oh, Ted cares too much" or "Ted checks in too much." I think now more so than ever, it's important. The second part is around second pillar is around prioritizing impact and well-being. Uh, when I think of well-being, I think of the energy, focused energy that delivers significance. I think as human being, we're all put in this earth for a finite amount of period, and we want to make sure that our time is meaningful. And so, how do we think of meaningful work and impactful work? When just before I get started on that, I think that work has a bit of a paradox. Our societies all often focus on productivity, and this starts from the industrial revolutions where people were, uh, uh, paired with machines on an assembly line to accomplish mundane tasks. And then in the 80s, we saw like the age of the computer that had this explosive growth of productivity by this misconception of like I could do way more in less time, and it's even more so exacerbated with the smartphone revolution of believing this falsehood that we can multitask and that we're able to accomplish by doing two things at the same time, when in fact we human beings are horrible multitaskers. We are actually task switchers, and that comes at a great cost. On top of that, you have the competitive global landscape, which with increasing demands on companies that are demanding more from their teams. I've never heard a CEO that is saying, I'd like for our team to do less this year, or let's make less revenue. And so the paradox really lies in an era where the human capacity, the human body and the human capacity has not changed during this time. Our brains have not increased in size. We are not able to problem solve more than before because our brain capacity is larger. And yet, all of the demands have increased. And so we're kind of at an inflection point, and productivity shouldn't be the norm. In fact, we should be moving from productivity to this idea of impactful work. And because productivity really focuses on the quantity of work, it really solves for the sense of urgency and has a very short term view. Think about the times where you're checking off the to-do list on today, or thinking about what can I accomplish today. And it also requires additional time. We've all experienced asking for additional time to accomplish a certain task, or the deadline getting pushed further. And so we need to shift from productive to impactful, which focuses on the quality of work, solves for significant work, which means it has more of a long-term view. What kind of impact? How long will this impact matter? And then it also focuses us on prioritization of time rather than adding more time. Why is this important for designers? Well, I really love this quote from Katie Dill at Stripe, who said, uh, design's job is to help companies make sure that it's always thinking about its long-term impact on people. And you cannot talk about impactful work unless we're focusing on the customer. At its core, everything that we do should be focused on the customer. Designers' mandate is to unlock benefit for customers for to scale, for the business to scale. And so we really, if you're not having conversation about the customer, if you're having conversations about business before the customer, then your employees and your team will not feel that you're producing impactful work. And so that is a non-starter if we're not talking about the customer. So how do you prioritize for impact? Well, when you think of competing demands that come into a design teams all at all angles, it's important to have a process in assessing for impact. And during the working remotely, it's even more important to have a shared understanding. This is an example that I use for quarterly planning, which has a three prong approach. The first one is aligning on prioritization principles. I think it's important to work with cross-functional teams and having a shared understanding of what do we define as important work. And this is something that we use at Intuit, which really is divided into four different categories. First is run the business, and that really means like keeping the lights on. It's really around what kind of maybe compliance regulations do we need to have? What kind of prior commitments have we made engaged with? What kind of partners do we have to maintain? And so essentially, this is the most important type of work. The next category is critical growth levers. And so anything that impacts the plan of that given fiscal year or that the business plan is really aimed at delivering that. So anything with goals or objectives or a list of experiments that you have in the backlog, anything like that will have to go in a second one. The third one, meaningful improvements, is really focused on improving efficiency, sometimes improving process or reducing friction. Sometimes some new technology that will help like make teams work better. And then the last one is nice to have. So um, only when you've done A, B, C, and D can you think about those. And those are also a good bucket for incomplete briefs or things that haven't been properly thought through yet. The next most important part is, I think, especially for a design team that tends to uh, always get squeezed for time in between like demands of product and engineering, it's really important to scope the work from a design perspective. You may be familiar with something like this, which is the design thinking process. This one has a triple diamond, maybe there's a double diamond, but really essentially is about the discovery of the problem, solutioning, and testing those solutions. And so when we think of the different bodies of work that may come into a design team, it's important to start grouping them into the different areas of level of work to assess how much effort it's going to take. If you need to do more research, how long is that going to take? If the problem's already well defined, but now we're just ideating and brainstorming, or is it something that we need to like run several A/B tests? The third one, once you've done all of that, we're able to have a list of a backlog of work, and with that's divided into the different craft levels so people can understand, well, content is going to work so many hours, and visual or UX may require a little bit more. And it also gives us a waterline and the capacity for the team so that we can have informed conversation of what we can commit to and what we do not commit to. And that creates a forcing function of with our PMs and engineering teams as to like what design can actually do. And you could see the list of prioritization in that column. So once that's all done, we've kind of assessed impactful work. It's important to focus on the amount of energy and the how we're going to do the work. I like to talk about energy rather than time because time is finite and energy is oscillates between renewable and expending of energy. I think like our human bodies, if you think of our heart rate kind of and our the way we breathe, is we all oscillate between expenditure of energy and renewal of energy. And the human body requires four different types of energy. At the foundation is the physical energy. This focuses on the quantity of energy that we're able to exert on a given task. Next is the emotional energy, which is really focusing on the quality of energy. A body of work may look really different if you're not in a good mood, or if you're really enthused and inspired, it may look completely different. And then you have the mental energy, and this is all about the level of intense focus you're able to generate for a given task. The human body cannot maintain focus for long periods of times, and it's important to be purposeful with and have focus time. So the last one is probably the most important one, is which is the purpose energy, which I like to call like the spirit energy. And this really is the energy that when you're aligned, your soul is aligned to the body of work, and that is in complete alignment. You get a lot more motivation getting out of bed when you're going into to work knowing that you're creating impactful work. And so let's start talking about the importance of physical energy. I know this is may seem um, uh, pretty obvious, but it's important to show how it impacts creative people. The late great Kobe Bryant was notorious at making sure that he would replenish his energy after like intense practice. And so I think from a design perspective and people who are in the creative industry, it's really important to make sure that our body regenerates. And sometimes we get into this mentality that we're going to work late hours and we're going to accomplish more, when in fact like it's we are our abilities to problem solve and our abilities to look at it, imagine the future, are directly impacted because it impacts like the hippocampus in your brain. And there's multiple studies that demonstrate that. Next, I want to talk about emotional energy. You can think about it from a spectrum of high to low or negative to positive. And when you think of when you're doing your most inspiring work, when you think you're in the zone and you're just knocking one project after the other, usually those feelings that you get are really like inspired. You feel focused, you're optimistic, you're engaged. And that's really what we call like the performance zone. uh, on the other hand, when you are not that and you're maybe in an environment where you're frustrated, you may not have some clarity on what the project is about, you feel anxious, worried, and fearful, and maybe even irritable. That is what we call the survival zone, and you're really in a fight or flight response. And the flight or flight response really is like ingrained in our human DNA, but really it harkens back to the Neanderthal days when we were trying to make sure that we weren't eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. I think like we're long past those days, and to be constantly maintained in a survival zone at work is really impacts our well-being. And that leads us at a sustained period in that way, leads us to exhaustion, feeling drained, hopeless. And that's really what we call the burnout zone. The one zone that we don't talk enough about, which is like essential to how we our bodies are created, is really around the renewal zone. And that's all about re-energizing your body, resting your body, similar to how athletes take rest during the day at periodical times. We think of the athletes talk a lot about this concept of periodization. And I think like taking regular breaks throughout the day, getting off camera, going for walks are really important in re-energizing and bringing you back into that performance zone. But too often we're either people are moving between survival and performance, or even at a sustained period between survival to burnout. So if you think of the environment of, for example, that fosters that, for example, in a burnout zone, you may be familiar that these kinds of environmental factors impact that. For example, immediate responses. Maybe you're with a manager that is always micromanaging you, or maybe you have to context switch often. That really leads to being always at a high anxiety level. And then you think about that at a sustained period of time without any change. Maybe there's a culture that starts to get infused where you're always expected to not to be working, always expected to be on, or always expected to answering messages on Slack. And maybe even your manager's not considering how your life is impacted by all of this. And so we need to think about better ways and ways to foster the performance zone, like recognition, praise, having clarity on our objectives. I think like being more clear on what is expected of our teams is really important in ensuring that I don't need to worry about X, Y, or Z. Um, Maybe sometimes having team events where people could get off camera and connect, or do something else besides their day-to-day work. Making sure that as individuals you're taking regular breaks, and that we're creating a culture where being off camera is okay too. Or and when you think about renewal zone, is really around having those regular check-ins, making sure that your team feels supported, making sure that they have the permission to take mental breaks, because like we're all impacted by the events around us, and focusing on things like simple things like deep breathing and having group meditation sessions. So you could start to see how there's different activities that you can create to create this renewal of energy back to expenditure at a high performance level. Now, I used to do check-ins with my teams, and when I used to ask the question, "How are you doing?" I would always get the same response: "I'm doing fine. I'm good." When we know there's a lot more emotions than just good and fine or sad and glad. Uh, and so we're so used to automating our answers that way that we stop to think about how we truly are feeling and how we're impacted by the events around us. And so I've been using this framework for weekly retros, which is taken by the Mood Meter by Mark Brackett, the founder of Emotional Intelligence. And by it helps expand our vocabulary on the levels of emotions that my teams are experiencing. And upon reflection, they're better able to articulate the root cause and the activities and the behavioral environments that cause the way they feel. And when we're able then to have more intentional conversations and talk about strategies of how to move from one zone to another and help create an environment and maintain and foster an environment that really fluctuates between renewal and performance. And this is especially important for people that are usually high performers, that are always looking to achieve above expectations, because they tend to burn out at a higher rate. And so it's really crucial to for leaders to stay on top of that, to really regularly check in. Here's some key takeaways. Just make sure that you're indexing always for impactful work, and focusing on understanding the different levels of energy that people are experiencing. The third pillar is understanding, uh, knowing your why and what your where. It's really all about understanding purpose and vision. And I think like in these times of remote work, it's especially important. I like to use this simple framework by Simon Sinek, um, that focuses on the why, the how, and the what. We often know what we're doing. We don't always know how we're doing it or with what purpose. And I think like having clarity on those things is really crucial. That could be at the individual level, that could be at the team level, or even at the organizational level. I think it's especially important during these remote times to focus now more so than ever on the how, because the how we work is really going to dictate how people are impacted in the future. I think we need to be able to adjust to different expectations. We need to be able to put employees at the center of all of this, and to be able to be flexible on how we work as we're kind of navigating through these challenging times. And of course, there needs to be a vision as to where are we going as a team, where are we going as an individual, and how do I fit into the larger organization. That really focuses on a future state of, if everything was fulfilled and your purpose was fulfilled, what would that start to look like? What would in an ideal world or in a future state, would you be doing? And so I think it's really important for leaders and managers to understand both at the individual, team, and organizational level, and to have these conversations on a regular basis and check in with each other on how we're tracking towards those. And lastly, I'd like to cover is cultivating shared leadership. I think it's really important, more so than ever, to double down on people's strengths. I think too often we tend to look at opportunity feedback and areas of improvement, and those are fine. But I think at some point people cap, and it's important to for people to then double down on what their strengths are and foster and amplify the unique individualities to help amplify the rest of the team. Going back to my analogies of basketball, if you think of the 90s Bulls team, they were so successful because they had unique individuals that were specialists in their areas of expertise. For example, Dennis Rodman was the leading rebounder for a decade, and his sole purpose was to capture all the rebounds. Didn't care about shooting, didn't care about passing. It was only about rebounds. And the team were so reliant on his performance, and it really created this idea of ownership because he didn't have to score points because Michael Jordan was the biggest and the best scorer of all time. And so Michael Jordan didn't have to focus so much on rebounding because Dennis Rodman was there to do that. And same goes for Scottie Pippen, who was the leading assist leader on the team and really transformed the game. And so you could see that each individual had their own area of expertise because the team was emphasizing and relying on those areas of leadership. I think we should be changing our concept of leadership, that it's only one person as a leader, but everyone can be a leader, because that everyone has something to contribute. And when people feel empowered, that they have an area of ownership, then they will be more engaged and they will contribute more and they will amplify and elevate the rest of the people around them. So when you think about cultivating leadership, you can think about mastering your craft, creating a culture of recognition, having a shared learning and shared ownership. And that really creates areas where people can really double down on what they love to do, and empower people to have personal growth, because sometimes there might be some growth areas that I want to focus on that may not fit into the roadmap or the particular bodies of work that I'm assigned to do. And I think it's really important to still have those conversations with teams to really ensure that they feel empowered to grow in different areas that can really help elevate and really inspire the rest of the team. And also just doing so in a way that is fun and engaging. We always do our best work when we're have positive emotions, and it's really imperative on leaders to think about ways to be creative and to engage people in a fun and engaging way. So just to summarize, 4 key takeaways is really around fostering psychological safety, managing impact and energy, knowing why and where you're going, and cultivating an area of shared leadership. I'll leave you on this quote by Phil Jackson, who was the Hall of Fame coach and 11-time champion between the Lakers and Bulls. And, he really was great at dealing with all of the different, strong egos on the team that really had high levels of performance, and was really around just letting them be and grow as individuals. And that's what we should all think about, is how do we think about letting people foster to be their best selves, and then creating a culture and a structure around that with clarity, with flexibility, so that people can have the space to grow within that. If you like my presentation and want to know more about the assets I've created, some amazing designers that I took the typography from. So please, help BIPOC designers. And also, we're hiring at Wealthsimple. So if you want to join our team, please reach out. Thank you for your time.